Today on Historia Nostra, I'm talking to an expert from the University of Saskatchewan about history on board games. I'll let him introduce himself.
My name is Benjamin Hoy. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Saskatchewan, and my research looks at Borderlands history and the history of Indigenous people.
In this, part one of my interview with Dr. Hoy, we're talking about the evolution of board games in North America and how past generations learned history from board games. In the second part of our discussion, we'll talk about how modern board games represent historical themes and how these games can be improved for educational purposes. Okay, so Dr. Hoy, we are talking about board games today. Would you like to tell me a little bit about how you use board games in your own teaching?
Sure. So I'm kind of a weird person in that I got into history as someone who doesn't like reading at all. So I sort of grew up playing board games, computer games, games like Civilization and Age of Empires, and that's where I came to love history. As I was doing research, I became more and more interested in how games teach history, not only in sort of the present, but also in the past. And so some of my early research has gone to the Strong Museum of Play, which I didn't know. There's a museum of toys and games in Rochester, New York. It's incredible, but they have 100-year-old toys and some of the earliest games ever produced in the United States, which came about in about the 1780s, 1790s. And you can actually play these. Every year, a bunch of researchers go down to Rochester, and they sit around playing 100-year-old board games together. And I started to think about, if games were some of the earliest forms of history that I learned about, how did people 100 years ago or 50 years ago learn about history? And as it turns out, they learned a great deal, especially about Indigenous people and colonialism. But they thought about games, I think, quite differently than we do. So games in the early 19th century were seen as a way to teach children about their adult lives. So this is where the emergence of kindergarten and some of those early pieces of our education come from this time period. And they saw games as sort of teaching kids about mechanical aptitude, how to do trade work, but also, basic skills for life. Like you would give, instead of giving young girls a pre-made doll that they would play with, you would give girls a partially made doll that if they wanted to play with, they had to learn how to sew. And so it became a way to teach sort of very practical skills to children. And some of these early games were aimed at adults as well as kids. But they're really interesting because there's all kinds of different rules. Like you can't have dice in a lot of early games because it would promote gambling. So they're there to teach about morality, more than many of the games today are. And so games like Monopoly was originally created to teach about the horrors of capitalism. Games like Chutes and Ladders or Snakes and Ladders was there to show about moral decision making. So a lot of the games that we play today actually had a specific purpose in society when they were created 100 years ago. So that's sort of what I became interested in, was seeing how these games portrayed American life and really translated ideas that were meant for adults, things like war and violence, to children.
Mm-hmm. So talking about games as they would have historically taught people lessons, how did that translate in your research or your interest into how games teach history and how people would have understood certain topics?
Yeah, so a lot of my early research has been on how historic games and contemporary games portray Indigenous people. So it's one of the first sort of major topics that board games in the United States and Canada deal with. And what I was sort of trying to figure out is, do they present Indigenous people in the same way 100 years ago as they do today? If not, what changed and why? And if you start to look at a lot of the early games, they're focused really heavily on violence. They're focused on conquest, they're focused on warfare, they're focused on sort of the unknown, sort of traveling out into the unknown and encountering Indigenous people. This sort of, a lot of the tropes that you'd imagine, sort of savagery and whatnot. And that shifts right around the 1960s with the rise of the civil rights movement and all of these changes. It's a slow transition. But what it shifts into today is a history that actually downplays violence. If you look at almost all of the games produced for sort of a wide market audience, portraying Indigenous people are portrayed as helpers of colonialism, which is almost a complete shift from 100, 150 years ago. And both are actually really problematic. So on the one hand, you have only violence being portrayed. On the other, colonialism becomes sort of benign, not really a problem. All of this sort of conquest is stripped out. And instead, in some cases, you have an Indigenous man reaching down to help the colonizers up into the mountains that contain gold. And if you know anything about the history of California, that's a fairly violent and sad process. So you see this sort of polar opposites on either end. And for me, one of the questions was, how do you get from those sort of early depictions of violence to the sort of modern depictions that sort of sanitize all the violence away and is this big happy story of colonialism? And some of that comes down to the sort of uniqueness about board games. So board games, the industry is quite different than a lot of other industries in that the profit margins are really low. So if you're going to make a board game, you have to know that you can sell it. And so in this sense, board games are a really good reflection of this sort of general culture because they tend not to be sort of pushing culture in too much. They tend to reflect dominant views of the time period because they need to sell not just most of their copies, but ideally all of their copies in order to stay in business. And so they're a really wonderful way to trace how society thinks about a topic over time.
Board games, historically, were educational tools that reinforced contemporary ideas about gender roles, morality, and a social order that put white settlers and Indigenous North Americans in violent conflict with one another. As a result, board games are valuable sources for historians. Tune in next week for part 2 of my interview with Dr. Hoy. For now, if you'd like to learn more about the history of board games or Dr. Hoy's research, check out the links in the description. Our theme music is by Broke for Free. You can learn more at brokeforfree.bandcamp.com.